There's a new partnership forming on the global stage, and it might just be a real challenge to China's dominance. We'll tell you about some of the successes and challenges ahead for Africa and its partners. Also this week, more on Volkswagen, its first loss in 15 years as it reels from the emissions cheating scandal. But how much will it really end up paying in fines and recall costs? And will these workers manage to keep their jobs in the process? And a demographic time bomb which has been holding back growth. China ends its 1970s one-child policy as part of a new economic plan. You know, if the continent of Africa were to have a best friend, we'd probably say it was China. It's invested billions there, building infrastructure and doing business well before other countries tried to get in. But now another country with more than a passing acquaintance with Africa wants to cement its future there, and that is India. Case in point, New Delhi has just hosted an India-Africa summit this past week, and leaders and business players from every African country came along. India's big push was that it wanted to promote a relationship between continent and subcontinent, but one that was particularly beneficial to Africa. Many saw that as a dig at China, which is often seen as just coming into Africa and making lots of money for itself. India is also looking for political influence, seeking support from the 54 African nations to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Why the big love-in over Africa now? Well, it's the second largest and second most populous continent on Earth. Well over 1 billion people are living there in 2015. And that translates into economic growth. The total GDP of the African continent is now over $2.8 trillion and has been growing at over 5% every year. Now, yes, China is a big factor. Have a look at this. Chinese trade with Africa, $160 billion a year. For the record, the European Union remains the biggest trading partner. And at this stage, India is less than half of that. Trade is only $71 billion a year. It is targeting $90 billion, though, by the end of this year. But unlike China, which tends to invest in huge infrastructure and vanity projects, India is relying on its corporations and large diaspora to win over hearts and minds. And you know, there are successes. In a moment, Haru Mutasa will take a look at how Zimbabwe is looking to India to help revive its industry. But first, India's largest automobile maker, Tata, is in Senegal, where it's replacing polluting French-made vans with Indian-made buses. Nicholas Haak starts us off.
Every morning, no matter how hard she tries, Abijata is always running late for work. She works in town but lives in the suburbs. Finding reliable transportation isn't easy. This is the best option. They're called Car Rapide, but they're anything but fast. Frequent stops, breakdowns, and traffic congestion makes this the most unpleasant part of Abby's day.
I dread this moment, where I have to sit in here for hours endlessly. The buses always smell of gasoline. It's such an unpleasant start to the day.
Imported from France, these old Renaults have been around since the 1970s. Senegalese drivers have added colorful touches to the exteriors, but on the inside, the basic mechanics haven't changed in more than 40 years. The state wants to get rid of them in a bid to reduce pollution and the volume of traffic.
These vans are dangerous and not adapted for a modern city. Our goal is to replace them with vehicles that will offer more comfort and a better service for people working in town.
Bus drivers had their say on which manufacturer would replace the Car Rapide. Much to everyone's surprise, they chose the Indian car maker Tata to revamp the entire transport system, outbidding Chinese and European car makers, including Renault, who offered better quality buses that pollute a lot less than Tata. But the Indian car maker was cheaper and willing to modify its vehicles to adapt to Senegalese driving.
The traffic in India is very similar to the traffic that you find here in Dakar. And so the Indian manufacturer believes that it has the know-how and the fleet of vehicles adapted for this environment to get people from the suburbs into the city and decongest this growing metropolis.
We understand the kind of vehicles that are required here. We ourselves are a developing country. We do understand the kind of technology which is required.
And so Tata is betting on this, the Magic Ace. With 1 million sold in India, it's a no-frills van. There are no windows in the back or electronics, just a strong engine. But it still needs to convince African consumers. Tata is testing the magic in Senegal and had to already make changes, more headroom and better suspensions, making Abby's commute home a little less bumpy, a little more comfortable, but still a long journey home.
Zimbabwe's manufacturing sector used to employ more than 200,000 people. Now it's fewer than half that figure. So government officials are looking to India for help in reviving struggling companies, like the Zimbabwe Iron and Steel Company, now called New Zim Steel. India, an emerging market, stands to benefit from Zimbabwe's iron ore exports. Zimbabwe has been trading with India for decades, but there have been problems.
It's a long-standing relationship, but given the fact that I would say the economy of Zimbabwe has been going through some difficult times, and that has obviously has had an impact between the trade and the economic ties between the two countries. And so currently I would say that things are somewhat dormant.
Over the years, thousands of people have lost their jobs because of widespread electricity shortages, falling manufacturing output, and businesses downsizing or closing.
I was born in 1954. As from 1954, I think my parents were working in this company. Even then, I also worked in this company, and I've raised my children from this company, but the way it is happening now is something which is very disgraceful.
Laid-off workers have been told by the government a new investor is coming and New Zim Steel will resume operations soon. This used to be Africa's largest steel manufacturer before it collapsed in 2008. More than 5,000 people used to work here. The place was busy. The steel was sold all over the world. Now it's barely functioning. But some fear of investing in Zimbabwe because of political instability, allegations of corruption and indigenization, a policy that favors black Zimbabweans.
The motivation behind indigenization is to scale up the involvement of locals in the economy. And it is a good policy because it provides for political stability. If we can have a situation where we have a strong black middle class.
Zimbabwe's biggest export to India is cotton. Officials say the country has potential to export more precious minerals like diamonds and raw materials like iron ore. Zimbabwe imports medical drugs from India and electrical appliances. So far, the trade balance favors India, something Zimbabwean officials hope to change.
So Africa and India, we've got one of our Counting the Cost regulars to join us this week to talk us through that. It's Razia Khan in London, who's an economist and head of Africa research at Standard Chartered Bank. Razia, nice to see you again. What can India do differently in Africa to what China's done? You know, we all know China is the big influence. From what you can see, has India got a different approach?
Well, there's been a lot of focus, of course, on these rising trade corridors. And whilst Africa-China has been seen to be really exceptional, we've seen an increase in the amount of Africa-China trade from barely $4 billion in the mid-1990s, closer to $224 billion more recently. When one looks at the India-Africa trade numbers, the numbers look less impressive, but the growth rates are still very significant. Very crucially, there's been a big difference in the nature of involvement. We've seen a lot of state-to-state engagement in the case of China, and of course, when it comes to a lot of the India-Africa engagement, a lot more of it is driven by the private sector, by private sector Indian corporate entities investing more in Africa.
And so do you believe then, Razia, that that is a better approach, that going through the private sector and making things happen that way is more effective, if I use that phrase, than a state-led approach? You know, the handouts and the infrastructures, even the sort of vanity projects, which we have to admit do become a feature of this sort of thing.
Well, as is always the case, there are probably two ways of looking at this. One is, why have we seen this huge increase in the amount of China-Africa engagement? It followed on very specifically from the kind of policy that China had adopted as regarded Africa, and also a lot of the Chinese policy banks making available to Chinese entities cheaper financing for their export activities into Africa. So even though we've seen rising trade shares between Africa and just about every other region in the world, it pales in comparison with respect to China. Now, of course, we've been aware of the other side of that as well, the criticism that there hasn't been as much engagement with Africa's private sector, that the benefits have been fairly limited, the infrastructure is good, but what does it really do to build capacity in Africa itself? And this is perhaps an area where India will hope that it can differentiate itself somewhat. The very fact that it is more private sector to private sector should have implications for non-government job creation that should be better able to weather the economic cycles that are caused by fluctuations in the amount of resources that governments have to spend. That, of course, is about to be put to a key test because of perceptions of the China slowdown, because of the volatility that we've seen in commodity prices. We are expecting that there may well be a slowdown in the amount of government-driven activity in Africa, simply as different governments feel the need to put in place more of a fiscal consolidation. In this respect, is the rising level of private sector FDI, including the FDI from India, going to be enough?